Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I'm an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. If you would like to learn more about any of my patterns, please check in the description below. And there you will find a link to my Ravelry store where you can browse through pictures of all of the patterns I have available that you can purchase and download a PDF so that you can knit it yourself. And if you are working on knitting any of my patterns or planning on it or want to chat about it, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Or you can pop over. You will also find a link to my Facebook group for Watch Barbara Knit, where it's sort of, it's semi-private the way that Facebook groups are private. And that way we can share pictures if we want to without having to worry about anything. It is, what Thursday is it? I don't know. I think it's the second Thursday, maybe the third Thursday. I don't know. But what I do know, it is time for Let's Talk. What Let's Talk is essentially me saying, hey, let's talk about whatever knitting subject I decide I want to talk about. I've talked about different shawl shapes and different pattern styles and different types of tools. And it's just pretty much me talking. So today's subject I want to talk to you guys about is stitch markers. And I'm sure you're like, you can talk for 15 minutes about stitch markers? And I can tell you, yes, I can indeed talk about stitch markers for 15 minutes. I could probably talk about stitch markers for a lot longer. And since stitch markers are tiny, I have taken some prep photos that I'm going to split screen and show you guys, because showing these tiny things to Mr. Webcam is not going to be particularly helpful. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the different types of stitch markers, and the two broad categories I would break them down into is removable stitch markers and non-removable stitch markers. What does that mean? Well, traditional stitch markers are closed, and the way you use them is as you're knitting, when you reach the point where you want to mark something, you place that stitch marker on your needle and then continue to knit. And then that stitch marker rides along with your knitting. It moves. So, but it's not at that point removable because it's stuck. It's locked in. It's on the needle or on your cable, and it's between two stitches. So once it's there, it cannot be removed until you hit that exact point where the stitch marker pops up between your two needles. A removable stitch marker is more commonly used in crochet, because since in crochet you only have the one hook, there's nothing for it to ride on. And so when you mark a stitch, you're putting the marker on it. And I have an assortment of removable stitch markers that I want to show you. This is, and there's going to be a picture here. As you can see, it's got this big loop, and it opens like a safety pin. You can see, but the top is really simple. This is a little sharp, and there you've got that style. And then similar, but not the same as that is what's called a coilless safety pin, which is this little guy here, right? I want you to see the head. Now you see the difference between the head on that one? I mean, is it focused now? Yeah. The head on that one and the head on the other one. The head on this one still looks like a traditional safety pin, where this one, it's just open. That is important later. Then you have your typical locking stitch marker or removable stitch marker. This is a plastic one. I have these laying everywhere and I use them all the time. It just opens and closes. It's not sharp. There's nothing for anything to catch on. It's made out of plastic. And then when you get into handmade stitch markers, people who make the removable ones, they use like earrings, the lobster claw. This is a lobster claw style. Here, I'll show it to you, and there'll be a picture, right? And if you'll recognize this, if you have jewelry, see it opens and closes. It's like a claw. And then this is actually, someone has made this one, and it's actually an earring back. If you see it levers open like that, and this one's substantially more delicate. You'll notice that the lobster claw is a fairly heavy-duty thing here. Let me put my hand behind it. And this one's much more delicate for delicate work. So those are all the locking or removable stitch markers. And we will get to in a moment why that's significant. Now, when you get into the non-removable stitch markers, what are more the knitting stitch markers, I can't think of any reason why you'd use them in crochet. They can be broken down further into categories. You have your traditional ones that you can find commonly in local yarn stores, and they're just these little circles. That's all it is. It's a little circle. I have two different kinds here. As you can see, this one, see, I'm trying to squish it, and it's not squishing. I squish your head. But then you can also get these that are soft. Squish, squish, squish. And so they're just circles, and all you do is you put them on your needle as you're knitting, right? And these are your simple, and look at this. So you might ask why I have so many stitch markers. I've already dropped and lost one. I lose stitch markers like crazy. There it is. So you've got these little circle ones, which are both rigid and soft, and I could not find one. I know I have some somewhere. People make these that are more decorative, that it's a metal circle, and sometimes it has a little jewel on it, and they're really pretty. Now, up from that, well, not up, but in that same category, you have, these are ring stitch markers, but they have decorative elements, which I adore. And as you can see, I have this tiny, tiny, tiny one. Isn't it cute? This is a Mad Eye Moody one. And then you have all these different things that can dangle from them. I love my little fish. He's very cute. Now, something that you have to watch for on these metal ones is that when they're doing the decorativeness, they have to be able to get whatever the decorative thing is onto the hoop. So there's going to be somewhere, and there's no way you can see this. You're just going to have to trust me. There's like a little crease. It's where the ring, they're jump rings, where the ring was opened, stuff was put on it, and then it was reclosed. And you have to make sure that those are well closed. If there's a gap, if you're working with fine yarn, it can fall in there or it can catch. So you have to watch. There are also stitch markers that are made with split rings. And again, you got to be careful with those because they can catch on whatever you're knitting. But that just depends on your knitting style. So you've got the ring style, and then you have your, I think this is called rat tail. I have no idea. It's these flexi style. So you've got, and in the picture you're going to be able to see, you've got this flexible, see, squish, 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 and it sticks out. See, it goes straight through. Boop, boop, boop. And they are flexible, and it's jewelry making stuff. And they make these, all different kinds of these that have this flexible loop. And I find, depending on what I'm knitting, I sometimes prefer this style because when you have the rigid style, if you have, sometimes you know, you knit and you have a death grip on your knitting, and if you have a lot of these stitch markers on your needle, you can feel them under your hand. And again, that is more a problem with my knitting style than the stitch markers. But if you're using a lot of stitch markers and you have a tight grip on your needle, these flexible ones might be more desirable for you. I like both styles. Obviously, you can see I have a bunch of each, and it depends. And it seems silly, but like I love this one, but I only use it when I'm knitting with bulky yarns. For one, it's got a fairly large loopy-doo, and another, I'm not going to use something tiny, tiny like this when I'm working with a large yarn because I can't see it. But nor am I going to be knitting with lace weight and using Gigantor stitch marker because it just, I don't know, it just doesn't work for me. And then I wanted to show you, you get to the point where your stitch markers are actually jewelry for your knitting, and it's amazing. These are absolutely beautiful stitch markers from Everyday Peacocks, and you can see that and there'll be a picture They are just gorgeous. They are the ring style with the dangles, but they're so, you know, it just makes knitting a little bit more beautiful because you have your beautiful yarn and you're working on your beautiful pattern, and having beautiful stitch markers are just amazing. So that is another ring style. So we have your removable and your non-removable. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how stitch markers are used. I adore stitch markers. I have tons of stitch markers. I have boxes of stitch markers. I always want more stitch markers because A, I lose them, and B, they're incredibly useful. The most typical thing you will see if you are knitting in the round, you are almost always told to place a stitch marker to denote the beginning of your round. And again, they're talking about this style stitch marker that is going to ride with your knitting. Now, you can also use the removable markers as riding markers that are going to go along. You just slip them on like that, right? It works just fine. So you just, it lets you know when you've gotten back to the beginning of the round. Now, sometimes you're going to need to be able to know, especially if you're knitting in the round, you need more than one kind of stitch marker, because maybe you need to mark the beginning of the round and halfway, because like if you change something in like halfway through the round, and then what you're going to need is two distinctly different stitch markers. So you're knitting along and you don't go, oh, I'm at the end of round, when you're actually just where you needed to do something else. So your round marker needs to be very distinct, and so it tells you this is the end or beginning of this round. And that gets into another thing you use stitch markers for. When you're knitting lace, a lot of people use stitch markers to mark your lace repeats. So what you do is when you're reading your lace pattern, it tells you, you know, work this X number of times. So you place that marker, and so you knit that repeat, and when you hit that marker, it's like self-correcting. It keeps you from waiting until you get to the very end of your row to find out you're like 2 stitches off. You can catch it earlier because you can make sure each section is correct. Another way that you can use stitch markers is to place them in your work to indicate, like if you're doing something long and complicated, to indicate, you know, this is where I switch from one stitch pattern to another stitch pattern. If you're doing a big texture pattern and it's like, okay, we work this texture pattern and then we work a panel of this texture pattern in the middle, and then we go back to texture pattern A. If you mark either side of that, then if you have the texture memorized, you can just keep on going without having to count. And that is one of my favorite things about stitch markers, and quite a few of my patterns use the instructions knit to marker, which is fabulous. You place this marker in your work, and that way you don't have to count so much. Instead of knit 12 stitches and then increase, and then on the next row it'll be knit 13 stitches and adding, it allows the pattern to be reduced because you're using the instruction knit to marker. It's like you knit to the marker and you yarn over, and that's something you need to pay attention to. Really, that's a big thing, and I didn't even write down, but now that I say it, you need to pay attention to if it tells you to yarn over and then slip the marker, or slip marker then yarn over, because that's going to make a big difference. If you are knitting to marker, yarn over, and then slip marker, that means this panel is going to expand while this panel stays the same size. If it's knit to marker, slip marker, and then yarn over, it's this panel that is, live long and prosper, it's this panel that is going to grow. And it makes a difference which side of that stitch marker you're making the yarn over. So that way you have to make sure you follow your pattern. And so you can mark that. And then the other thing I want to talk to you about the removable stitch markers, one of the things that's really fabulous about these is if you are working on a pattern that you're going to be picking up and putting down a lot, or if it's in garter, or if it's not like immediately evident which side is the right side and which side is the wrong side, early on in your knitting, if you take a removable stitch marker and lock it onto the right side of your work. That lets you know that anytime you put it down, if you pick it back up, you can figure out what side the right side is. Because I don't know if you've ever put it down like in the middle of a row and you're like, I don't know which direction I'm going. Removable stitch marker is your bestest bud. You put that on the front and it will tell you this is the front, and you never have to worry about that. Let me see. Stitch markers, they're so awesome. You can use them for, I like using removable markers for if I'm casting on a large number of stitches. Like if you got to cast on like 300 and some odd stitches, what I do is, you know, cast on 25 and then put a stitch marker, and then cast on 25 and then put a stitch marker. And so that way you can just go 25, 50, 75. You can just count those as opposed to having to recount when you can't remember where am I. And I like using the removable ones for that, because then it doesn't interfere with my knitting. Once I know I have my cast on correct, I can just pop those off and they're off. So having both removable or locking and the traveling stitch markers are a really good thing. So you need to have stitch markers in your arsenal. I would love to hear what your favorite stitch markers are, and you can tell me in the comments below. And if there's any way you use a stitch marker that's interesting or different that I didn't quite catch, then I would love to hear about it. If you like this video, please give it the thumbs up, click that like button. And if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video, please subscribe to my channel and select notifications. Thank you so much.